order. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the research team. We'll get some slides shared here. Let me introduce Dr. Lakelyn Taylor, a postdoctoral researcher in the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Vermont, and Dr. Elizabeth Doran, a research assistant professor in the College of Engineering and Mathematical Sciences at the University of Vermont. And I am also part of this research team, so I am wearing a couple of hats. So I get the pleasure of presenting the first couple of slides here. So we will be sharing research that is focused on understanding how flood information is communicated. Our work actually encompasses 6 different communities in the eastern United States, but one of our focus communities is Rutland and surrounding towns in Rutland County, Vermont. This work is being done by our team at UVM. Sarah Noyes was a member of our team and on the Lake Champlain Sea Grant staff and has moved on to other adventures. And then Jill Brown and a long list of collaborators at RTI International. I also want to acknowledge that as Vermonters, many of us have been impacted by flooding over the last several years. And while we are going to try to focus really on the communication flow paths, if you feel like this is a sensitive subject for you, just that warning note about it. I also want to acknowledge the support for the research comes from NOAA through the NOAA Cooperative Institute for Research Operations in Hydrology. And that the statements, findings, conclusions, and recommendations are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of NOAA. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Liz and Lakelyn to really tell the story of the research.
Thanks, Anne. Can everyone hear me? Amazing. Okay. So why are we talking about flood warning information? In order to set the stage here, I'm going to take us to North Carolina in late September of 2024, when the remnants of Hurricane Helene were affecting broad swaths of the region. We had numerous incidents of flooding across the region associated with that event, but particular examples came out of that event, such as the hospital in Unicoi, Tennessee, where breaking news during the flooding found that dozens of folks in the hospital were trapped on the roof of the hospital during the rapid rise in water levels. This event could have been much, much worse. These images are pretty traumatic, but a weather forecaster in a local regional office actually noticed before the flooding started that this was likely to occur in a very short time period and contacted the hospital directly, and they were able to evacuate patients from the facility before it was inundated. So the importance of flood warning information cannot be understated in this particular instance. If you can go to the next slide. This was just one of many, many, many extreme events that we are seeing across the country every year. Statistics from NOAA suggest that we have been seeing over the past 10 years almost $5 billion flood events every year. Not quite 5, but that's still a lot of damage in various parts of the country, and it is resulting in significant numbers of deaths, over 100 every year related to flooding. So we really want to be able to warn the public. Can you go to the next slide, Lakeland? And we want to make sure that the messages we're sending out have all of the relevant information that is necessary for folks to take appropriate and timely action. So in order to understand what kind of information is being communicated through communities during these flood events, we had looked at the literature and are adopting the IDEA model, which has emerged from crisis communication studies in other contexts, and working to apply it in this flood warning context. And this idea suggests that an effective risk communication message will have a number of key components. First, it will allow the audience to internalize that the message is for them, that it is relevant, that they are potentially going to be impacted because of their proximity or the timeliness of the event. It needs to have explanation about what is happening physically from the warning, and it needs to suggest specific actions that individuals can take upon receiving the message. Finally, it needs to come from a trusted source of information that folks will take seriously. So we're adopting this theoretical framework about what should be in the messages, but we are also trying to understand how the messages move from folks in NOAA, you can switch to the next slide, to the people who are taking action. And we hypothesized, well, before we started this project, actually, no one really knew what this kind of web of information looked like. Big question mark, kind of spaghetti, we call it. And we've been tugging on the spaghetti and trying to lay out the different pathways of communication that a weather model and then NOAA issuing an alert will take as it goes through the community and results in action. So this project, Lakelyn, you can switch the slide one more time, is trying to stretch out that spaghetti, like I said, and we're trying to understand who's receiving the information and what they're doing with the information as they pass it on to their subsequent audiences. And we're doing this project understanding that new types of flood warning information are also coming onto the scene, including flood inundation maps, like the one that helped that Unicoi hospital mitigate some even worse potential impacts. In addition to understanding how the messages are flowing, we're also trying to understand what is in the messages, which components of the idea model are contained within those messages. So link them one more time. There we go. We have our little framework on every single pathway, and we're trying to understand how the information is coming into the organizations and whether or not they're adding or modifying the components of that information as it passes through the community. All right. We are focused in particular not on the public per se. We're actually interested primarily in this project on audience, intermediate audience segments, including local authorities and decision makers, health and human service organizations, including hospitals like the one you saw earlier, as well as community interest organizations, faith-based organizations, watershed groups, folks who are taking information directly or from upstream services and redistributing them to larger groups within the community. And we hypothesized that there's various levels of responsibility within each of these groups for conducting this flood risk communication. So local authorities obviously have higher responsibility, while community interest organizations maybe have a lower level of responsibility for doing this work, but are still doing this work. So we want to understand how they're doing it. The data collection phase consisted of a number of focus groups. We invited members of each of these community audience segments to join us in a webinar, in an online forum, asked them a series of questions and initiated dialogue. We did this in 6 communities across the country, which you can see are all located on the East Coast, but have various levels and types of flooding, are different sizes, have slightly different geographies. So we're trying to understand in a broad swath how different communities are doing this flood risk communication. We talked to a total of 61 individuals across these communities and had members of each of the audience segments in each of those communities as well. In addition to the focus groups, we had a couple of holes and we filled those holes with individual interviews as well. So those are also included in our total participant number. Focusing specifically on Rutland, the audience segments that we talked to, the organizations that we talked to, included in our local authorities group, folks from Department of Transportation and Public Safety, as well as local news and media. The Health and Human Services organizations included hospital representatives, healthcare networks, and Salvation Army folks. And we talked to faith-based and water conservation community interest organizations in Rutland County as well. Okay, so we talked to a bunch of people. We had transcripts of these conversations, and we wanted to turn that dialogue into findings that we're going to share with you today. So we conducted what's a process of coding these interviews using descriptions that we were looking for, codes in the text, and we did this with multiple people so that everyone who looked at an individual transcript agreed almost 75% of the time, more than 75% of the time, on which codes should be applied and where. And then we synthesized those findings into the themes that Lakelyn is now going to share with you today across each of the components of the IDEA model. And we're going to share additional insights that are specific to Rutland County, as well as the broad theme findings from all of the communities and individuals that we talked to. So with that, I'm going to actually turn it over to Lakelyn to give you all the dirty details and findings from this extensive data collection.
Liz. So as we get into it, I want to reiterate the importance of this work and why we're doing it. And it's really to look at how local communities receive, share, and use and perceive flood communication. And that's why we're looking at all of this communication, all of this data through the IDEA model lens, is because that model is specifically telling us, in terms of message content and distribution, what's the most effective way to get flood warning and really risk messages out to communities and out to folks. So keep that in mind as we go through the results that we're about to unpack for you all. Because the first thing that we're going to talk about is that internalization piece. So according to the IDEA model, just as a reminder, the IDEA model says that one of the factors of importance when communicating risk messages to folks is to help them internalize that message, because you want to make it relevant and timely and proximate to them. And so when we were looking at the transcripts from our focus groups and interviews across our audience segments, some of the things that we discovered is that some of that specific relevance is lacking somewhat. The messages may include relevance of a flood is coming in your region, but in terms of community-specific relevance, that's not present as much. There's also that folds itself into that proximity piece. So when we talk proximities, we're talking space and how close or far away is it? Because in our risk and crisis communication literature, we know that the closer a disaster is or a crisis is, the more internalized people will make it. In our focus groups and interviews, something that came out in terms of proximity is that piece in terms of the message content is limited in information. So oftentimes the proximity will say the Winooski River is going to flood, but not necessarily what neighborhoods along the Winooski River will flood or be affected. And lastly, in terms of the internalization piece, it seems to be that the more responsibility an organization has, so think local authority types of folks, the earlier they receive the communication. And that timeliness piece in terms of when is the flood going to happen and how soon do I get that information all wraps up into internalization. So organizations that might have less responsibility or a lesser degree of responsibility might not get those messages in as timely a way. So what does this mean? What do all of these three themes really mean? The key takeaway for the internalization piece is that it's there. It's certainly not absent, but localized information that really focuses on direct impacts and directly who will be affected needs to be prioritized a little bit more than it's currently being talked about and discussed in these risk messages and these flood risk messages. So that's the internalization piece. Next, we're going to move on to the explanation piece. And as a reminder, the explanation part of the idea model says that we want to communicate the information to folks in a way that is clear, succinct, and accessible to them, while also still being transparent, honest, and accurate. So what we discovered when we talked to the local communities and the folks that Liz outlined for you all is that in terms of trusted sources, the federal, state, and local authorities are actually pretty highly trusted. So a lot of our participants, regardless of what audience segment they were coming from, reported that they trusted organizations like NOAA and the National Weather Service, even going so far as to say we also trust our local municipalities or our local governments as well. So that's a really good thing, because we learned that a lot of this communication is coming from those sources. And so there's a good link between the folks who are sending out this information and the high degree of trust that those who are receiving it have for them. The next part is that when we're explaining things like floods, we want to make sure that our messages are consistent. Because if we're sending out multiple messages across multiple platforms, we want all of those messages to be very similar or the same. And that, in terms of flood communication, has been really good. So flood information is generally pretty consistent, just no matter how many platforms it's sent across or by whom, that information is converging, which is a good sign. The last thing to note about this explanation piece is that in a lot of the flood risk messages that are being received and shared out, there is a good degree of technical information being included. So they'll say things such as this is the flood stage, or this is how much rain in inches we're expecting to get, or they'll include graphics of hydrographs or of different types of maps that might have some flood depictions on it. But what really helps with this explanation piece, and something that I really want to stress here, is that local knowledge part. Because the local knowledge and that institutional community knowledge that folks have actually helps translate technical knowledge and makes it more relevant for the specific community. And so that piece of it is highly important for explanation. And we're seeing that kind of taking place or emerging from our discussions. So a key takeaway for this section in particular is that the explanation part of this is actually really good because it is being consistent and it's being sent out by trusted sources. But perhaps capitalizing on that local knowledge a little bit more is where we can have some improvements. Next is action. And so when we look at the idea model and action specifically, what's important to note for this part of the model is that we want to state very specific actions that folks can take, even down to when to do it, how to do it, the whole 9 yards. In the messages that we were talking with folks about in our focus groups and interviews, one of the things that came up is what we're calling the Beatitudes of action. These are your action statements that say things like, be prepared, be ready, be on standby. And those are good because they're generic enough that people are expecting that level of action detail. The issue, and something that emerged in our discussions, is that sometimes those are hard to operationalize. So what does it mean to be ready? What does it mean to be prepared? What does that look like? Does that mean I need to evacuate? Does that mean I need to move my car to a higher level? What does that mean? And so the specificity of the action statements isn't always very clearly communicated, which goes into that next theme, that actions sometimes in these messages aren't communicated all that clearly. And so we had a lot of folks saying, oftentimes it's just kind of left up to us to figure out what to do and where to go, what resources are available. And then we try to communicate that to folks as best we can. Lastly, in terms of the action, there seems to be some hesitation to share action recommendations, especially the lower degree of responsibility an organization has. It seems perhaps that they might have a little bit more hesitance to share these action recommendations for a myriad of reasons, like liability or not wanting to be responsible for if people take action or not. So a key takeaway in this realm of things is that when we look at flood risk communication, it is very important as we move forward that actions are clearly defined and clarified for folks. If you want somebody to do something, you need to tell them exactly what you want them to do and when you want them to do it. So now we've covered the kind of outside triangles, the I, E, and A. And you might be thinking to yourself, Lakelyn, what about distribution? Well, that comes next. And so in our project, not only did we look at themes, but we created what you see on the screen now as these, what we're calling communication pathways. And so we used the themes from the distribution discussions we had with folks to map out what that looks like for our communities. And so the communication pathway you see on the screen now is a merger of all of our audiences. And after I go through this with you all, I'm going to show you the Rutland County specific ones. But for now, I wanted to show you what the overarching map looked like and what we kind of learned from bringing all of the locations together. So first, as I mentioned earlier, there are common sources that seem to emerge across audience segments, across our locations. So no matter who we really talk to, a few core sources emerged. So organizations like NOAA, the National Weather Service, local authorities are also pretty common across our segments and locations, primarily city governments, public works, public safety, fire departments, police departments, and local emergency management, which sometimes expanded into municipal level, county level, or state level emergency management as well. When we look at distribution, though, it's not just about who is sending the messages, it's also what channels are they using. And we had across our locations and audience segments a few common channels, and those are more of what I would term are formal communication routes. So emails, websites, alerts that you get on your phone, text messages or phone calls, and even a slightly, I would say, more informal mode of communication channel, word of mouth. So you can see in our chart, these are color coded. So when a channel is being used, it's highlighted on the communication pathway. And so those 5 channels were the ones that consistently, again, across our segments and across our locations, kept coming up over and over and over again. So what does this mean? Exactly, right? What's the key takeaway for the distribution across all of our folks that we interviewed or had conversations with? Well, primarily, it means that the flood information is mostly disseminated in a kind of top-down structure, is what we discovered. But that it's being sent by sources that folks trust. It's being sent from the same kind of sources, which is good to some extent. And the channels are pretty consistent as well, which means that folks during a flood will know where to go and who to go to. And that's very important when, especially in cases where flooding happens a little bit more rapidly and there's less time before the event occurs. So that is our distribution across audience segments and locations. Now I want to focus a little bit more on Rutland County specifically, since we are talking about how all of this flood communication kind of was actualized in one of our key locations. So as we go into this, what we have done is in our project is we've created what we're calling community location dashboards. And these dashboards show basically the communication pathways I was just showing you all. It's those plus a more detailed version of that map for each of our locations. And so we have these dashboards, which will be interactive when it becomes publicly available. This will be something that you all, other community folks, can click through and really investigate for themselves. So for Rutland County specifically, we talked with the Rutland County Mutual Aid Association, Fire Mutual Aid Association, a news media organization, and the Vermont Agency of Transportation. And what we learned when looking at these are all of our local authority level audience segments. And a lot of that communication is very formalized and more top down. So they're getting it directly from NOAA, and there's not, although there is some, there's not necessarily a ton of inter-organizational communication. But I do want to draw your attention to the fact that one of the maybe more common sources of information that weren't from the folks that we talked with is the Vermont Emergency Management. So Vermont Emergency Management, or VEM, actually came up a lot of times in our discussions with our community folks, especially in Rutland County. There seems to be a good communication pathway to and from VEM, which is really good. That's a strong tie. And they're a great organization to be connected with. Next is our Health and Human Service organizations. So we talked to the Rutland Salvation Army, the Medical Center, and we also talked with a Community Care Network organization. And you'll notice here that the communication pathways start to get a lot more numerous, right? Because we're incorporating a bit more of that, again, that top down. So when it's just local authorities, it's really just kind of them. And then who do they kind of talk to comes, now you're seeing that outlined. for Rutland County specifically, again, you've got a lot of Vermont emergency management. There's a lot of discussion, it seems to be, between your health and human service organizations and the media. And you do have some direct communication between the health and human service organizations and NOAA or the NWS themselves. And then those organizations, the health and human service organizations, typically will communicate to their staff, their employees, their clients, folks who utilize their services, which is something we kind of expected and was revealed in our research. Lastly, we looked at the community interest organizations, and for Rutland County specifically, we looked at 2 faith-based organizations and a watershed conservation group. Most of the watershed group had a little bit more communication, 1 with NOAA, but 2 with our local authorities. The 2 faith-based organizations that we talked to didn't get quite as much communication from quite as many sources, is what seemed to be the case. Although they did report that if they were going to share these types of messages, they would most likely do it to their congregants, family members, and people that relied on them. All of those 3 different kind of audience segments that are outlined here, and something to highlight, I think, is that in both the last one with our health and human services and with our CIOs, our community interest organizations, there's not a communication pathway that directs or that links the community interest organizations with the health and human service organizations. So that seems to be a little bit of a gap, which you bring that all together to create this very high detailed map. And I know that this is very hard to read. It becomes easier when you can kind of click into it and mess around with it and become interactive. But for Rutland County, what we discovered is that there's a lot of good communication going from our federal organizations to our local authorities. And then local authorities are talking with health and human service organizations and community interest organizations. But there's not a lot of communication between health and human services and community interest organizations. So that's from a high detail, very specific level, what we were finding in Rutland. But that doesn't necessarily get out the channels that they were using or what it means, right? So that's what we're going to focus on here. So in this lower detailed map, in this a little less complex map, I want to highlight some of the things that I've been talking about already. So NOAA NWS talks to the local authorities through a wide range of communication channels. And right now, are currently the only entity that's using the NOAA flood inundation map, which makes sense because it's still in the rollout phase. Next is the fact that local authorities, health and human service organizations, and your local and your community interest organizations are all receiving flood communication. And that's really, really good. So there's not a group or an organization that is being completely left or is not getting at least some degree, some level of flood communication. Sometimes that looks a little different. The timing of that can be a little different, but everyone is getting or seems to be getting this communication. And then lastly, again, that missing piece between interorganizational communication in terms of the local authorities are talking to everybody, but not everybody's talking to everybody. So that seems to be a place where maybe we can activate our communities to talk to one another and to talk to different services, different service organizations, and to get them talking to each other so that your end user local communities can be reached perhaps a little bit more effectively. So that kind of wraps up the detailed version of our findings. And so what we want to do as we wrap up today is remind you of those key findings. So I know it's been kind of like an information dump, but if you walk away with a couple of things, I think these are the things that we really want you all to kind of internalize and to hear. First, localized information needs to focus on those impacts. Like that really needs to be prioritized when we're looking at flood warning communication. Not just this river is going to be flooded, but what does that really mean for neighborhoods, for communities, for businesses and organizations? And what does that mean from an impact, damage, consequence type of perspective? Next, flood communication currently seems to be happening in a top-down approach, which is not necessarily a bad thing because a lot of the sources are trusted and it's happening in a way that the messages are pretty much consistent. Where that becomes an issue when you have a top-down approach is that sometimes information can stagnate in that flow. Sometimes information or communication channels are disjointed or organizations don't talk to each other. And so then that information can get lost or can just stop somewhere. And so we want to make sure that even if we're using a top-down approach, that we're communicating around and inside of it so that we don't have some of those stoppages. Next, flood information is communicated consistently, but it needs that strategic translation. Not just, granted, language translation would be a big help and a big advantage to communicating flood messages. But what we mean here is translating that technical information into information that your audiences really understand and can conceptualize for themselves, which sometimes means using the local knowledge of a community to your advantage when you're communicating this out to folks. And lastly, remember, actions need to be specific. They need to be clearly defined and outlined for your communities. And so even if there's some hesitation to share, even if actions are present, if they're unclear, they're not going to be as helpful. So that is all of our results so far that we have that pretty much covers in a broad way the themes and communication pathways from our focus group and interviews. And this is our research team in totality. So we want to acknowledge and say thank you to all the folks who helped us get to where we are today. So thank you all very much. And I will turn it over now for Anne to facilitate any discussions, questions, comments, concerns, or sarcasms you might have.